patriotism, peace, working wages, vigor, and vitality. For Oswald Mosley, these principles stood above that of tradition, and despite how his detractors in the press sought to portray him, Mosley went against what many in his class considered economic and political orthodoxy because he thought it to be in the best interest of all the people. To Mosley, Britain should be for the British, and all institutional power, whether it be in government or industry, should flow towards that aim. Having seen his country brought low during the First World War, and having lived in political prison during the Second, Mosley had little patience for talk, and sought to live his life oriented towards action.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to live.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, welcome to our Human Rights Internet History podcast. I'm Nick, and I am joined this week by Adam and Hans.
Hey.
Hi. As well as our returning guest, Thomas. How are you, Thomas?
I'm very well, Nick. Lovely to be here again.
Well, thanks for coming back. Before we get started, I had my computer recently crashed, so if I'm missing anybody, I'll get back to them next week. But the two that I have written down here, I have a donation from a Max Stucky, all caps. Thank you, Max. And I had a very generous donation from a Cunt McFuck. Thank you very much, Mr. McFuck. We appreciate it a lot. It's very nice of you.
Probably not his birth name, but given the times we live in, one can understand why one would use a name like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. It's his name. I mean, it's our pal Cunt McFuck. What are you gonna do? He gave a nice donation, so thank you, Cunt. Anyways, today we're talking. We brought Thomas back on because previously he was on to discuss Enoch Powell, one of the great modern pariahs of Anglo politics from the 20th century. And now we're going to be discussing another one, someone, in fact, I think more controversial to a certain extent, which would be Oswald Mosley, Sir Oswald Mosley. So why don't we just start with his life in the beginning? Who was Sir Oswald Mosley? What was his family background? What was the world he was born into?
Well, before we even do that, I'd actually just like to ask our guest, since he's from the UK, how he even came to know who Oswald Mosley was, and why did he take an interest in him?
So Oswald Arnold Mosley. How did I came to be aware of him? As I've touched on before, when we spoke about Powell, I've been interested and actively involved in British far-right politics. I'm loath to call it that, but I guess that's the best description. And Mosley is someone of great import to the British national movement led by the National Front in the 70s, morphing into the British National Party in the 80s and 90s. There was a comedy skit about Mosley that I heard in the 80s by Not the 9 O'Clock News, which is a BBC alternative comedy program featuring Rowan Atkinson of Mr. Bean and Blackadder fame, where they talked about Mosley as a great leader, and I was interested as a very young man, and found out a little bit about him and realized they were being satirical, the scamps that they are, and that he was a big beastly fascist. I also, in reading P.G. Wodehouse as a boy, he was lampooned in some of the Jeeves and Wooster novels, there was a recurring character based on Mosley who was I forget his name, but he was characterized as a foolish prig, product of the upper class, purely pandering to his own ego. So this interests me. My nature has always been, if someone's being given a hard time by the media, they're probably not all bad. So I read Robert Skidelsky's biography of Mosley when I was a teenager, and it was Skidelsky. I don't know a huge amount about him. It's a name that sets off some alarm bells, but it is a very fair and beautifully written biography. I'm not usually a fan of biography, it's a very entertaining read. I would encourage anyone to have a look at it, although it's quite hard to get hold of nowadays. And I reread that in preparation for this discussion. And he's a man of hugely interesting. The biography is written in the context of what was going on in Europe and the world at that moment, and it serves as a really good breezy run through of late 19th century up to the post-war years, with this character Mosley striding through it in his own inimitable style. So yeah, it's when we had spoken the first time before we spoke about Powell, I was interested in discussing Powell because it was very topical, being the 50th anniversary of Rivers of Blood. But Mosley was someone that I was probably more familiar with, and someone who's quite often in British nationalist circles, someone who is still looked on with great fondness, and as you know, someone really could have made a difference.
Well, let's talk about some of his biography, as you mentioned it. Then, how did he become this figure that was being caricatured by the press, and in some circles, obviously respected? But the sort of understanding I have of him is effectively his sort of marches down the street, like the black shirts in Italy, almost wearing similar uniforms. And obviously there's parallels with the German regime as well. That's, I think, where people sort of visualize this person coming to the fore. But stepping back, how did he come to that? If any of you have
well, he certainly gained some notoriety prior to that in his time in Parliament.
Absolutely, yeah. He was a genuine product of the British aristocracy. He inherited the title of 6th Baronet of Ancoats from his father. The Mosley family was very wealthy, owned a lot of land in Staffordshire, in the Midlands of England. He was born into wealth and power. He was part of the landed gentry. At that time, when he was born in 1896, that whole class was obviously under siege by the middle class merchant and upper middle class merchant and banking classes. And we can go into this a bit more when we look at his motivations, but he grew up in this kind of throwback to the feudal system. There was the manor, the Rolleston, where the family seat, and pretty much everyone who lived around there was employed, Mosley family, as farmers, as carpenters, as artisans generally, and from that he gained this view of a paternalist society, but based on, for want of a better way of saying it, taking care of everyone, making sure everyone was okay. A paternal care and compassion for the people who lived in this environment, in this community. And that's one of the most interesting things when he later moves to be a self-proclaimed socialist, and then onto the new party in the British Union of Fascists, the media was very quick to characterize him as, someone born with a silver spoon in his mouth who was just an opportunist, just looking for power, just looking to make his own name. But I believe this feudal background and what he saw, not so much his father, who was an alcoholic and a buffoon, but his grandfather, who he had a very close relationship with. He really cared about this relationship between those who owned and ran the land and the ordinary people. And I think it was very genuine in Mosley all the way up to his death that he had this great rapport with the common man. And you can see it when he was out marching with the black shirts and he was out carousing with the lads in the East End pubs. He fit in. It wasn't artificial to him.
Well, his father allegedly accused him of never working a day in his life. Now, as you mentioned, his father may not have been the most credible source for that, but have you heard that claim?
Well, Mosley talks about this in his autobiography, and the fact is he can't exactly deny that he didn't. He was not a laborer. I mean, he did various work around the family lands, but more to the point, he served in the First European War, and that was. To him, he found it rather absurd that his father would throw that at him, having served in one of the more dangerous areas of the First European War.
I would agree. I mean, if you put yourself in risk like that.
His relationship with his father, as Thomas mentioned, was very poor, especially later. He, if I remember right, Thomas, his grandfather bequeathed the estate to Oswald while his father was still alive.
That's correct, yeah.
And his father and his grandfather, their relationship was poor since his father had moved out to live at basically a local inn and pub or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he recounts a very funny incident where his grandfather basically says to his father, I could whip you with one hand tied behind my back. And they actually went ahead and did this. And he boxed him with one hand tied behind his back and won.
Yeah, and by all accounts, that's perfectly true. There's records of that being a common practice in the Mosley family. They were keen boxers and fencers and would fight each other, father and son, sometimes just for sport. But in this case, I think it was a bit more than that. Grandfather Mosley wanted to let his drunken prodigy know that his behavior was unacceptable. But
his father, he lived largely separate from Oswald's mother, correct?
Yeah, they separated when he was a very young man. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
A child. So, and he lived with the big influences on him as a child were his mother and his grandfather, but his paternal grandfather, not his mother's father. And it's true. He probably never did do a day of work in his life because the fact that by the time he was 18 years old, he was at the European front, as you mentioned. So he never went to university either. He was straight from school to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, the British equivalent of West Point. And he was already there with the mind to a military career when the First World War broke out, and received a commission in the 16th Regiment of the Queen's Lancers, which is a cavalry regiment, and one where one is not given a commission unless one is connected to the right people. And he obviously was connected to the right people. But he immediately volunteered to be a member of the Royal Flying Corps, the precursor to the Royal Air Force, and spent the early years of the war, the early months of the war to be more accurate, strapped into a box made of balsa wood and elastic, pretty much, flying over the German lines. And he actually injured himself very badly, first at Sandhurst, at the Royal Military College, jumping from a window during a ruckus, and later on while performing maneuvers in his aeroplane for the delight of his family, which so he was something of a cad, young Sir Oswald.
Well, as Thomas mentioned, he was had a very close relationship with his paternal grandfather, and upon him joining the Royal Flying Corps, his grandfather's reaction was very very emotional. And I'd like to read. I found this very interesting. This is just a short bit from my life. He says, when I told him him being his grandfather, when I told him in the latter months of 1914, just after my 18th birthday, that I had volunteered and been accepted temporarily to leave my regiment for service with the Flying Corps in France, he burst into tears. It was astonishing. He explained that he had been told that this was the most dangerous of all war services, and that I was all he had. If we had been classic Greeks, we would have fallen into each other's arms in a transport of mutual emotion. I should have explained in warm and passionate words all that I had felt for him. But I was just a frozen young Englishman. I could not move. I could say nothing. This has been a regret my whole life long. He died soon afterwards, and I survived the experience he feared for me. Why is it that we cannot overcome these barriers? They can, upon occasion, be surmounted by minds and characters at a certain level of common interest and attainment, but they too often arise between generations. My relation with my grandfather was certainly more intimate than his contacts with his own grandfather, before whom he had accustomed to stand to attention like a soldier on parade at the height of the Victorian era. Manners were formal, and family discipline was strict in this early period at Ralston. I thought it was especially interesting, the classical Greek allusion, because that is a very significant contrast. And he actually talks, I forget where in which of his books he talks about this, but he talks about how the sort of gay, and not in the 21st century faggy gay, the gay and jovial character of the Greek spirit contrasted with the Puritanism that befell England. And he argues at one point that England had much more in common with that prior to the Puritan menace. But you still with us here, Thomas?
Yes, yeah, that was. I really enjoyed that piece as well from my life, and Skidelsky mentions it as well. It's an interesting insight into the family dynamic, and the whole Mosley's rejection of Puritanism and what the influence it had on British political and cultural life is very interesting.
Well, I hate to quote Pink Floyd, but I can't help it. It comes to mind that the hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way.
Very much so.
What was his relationship with the Anglican Church then? I mean, it seems like he was a pro-monarchical figure who was anti-Puritan from a political standpoint, but did he have any particular kindling for the English theocracy? Did he see the monarchy as a divine institution, or was it more of a Thomas Hobbesian power vacuum necessity? The idea that you need to have a Leviathan and absolute power just because that's the state of nature.
I would say more the latter. Mosley's connections with the church, with organized religion, is never a great subject of his own writings and writings about him.
Mm-hmm.
At most, he was married in a church. That's about as far as his commitment to Anglicanism seems to come across. He I don't think he was ever militantly atheistic. I don't have any record of him making those kind of statements. I think you can compare it, and I'm always loath to do this when you compare anyone to Hitler, but his whole relationship with religion is always very confusing to me. There are a lot of quotes where he seems to be very pro the influence of the church and what it can do, And then obviously there are a number where he is the antithesis of that. So,
Mm-hmm.
Well, the church.
A good read of English history shows that the church is essentially what organized, the English kingdoms and finally into the larger England as we know it today. So, I can understand if he saw it as a social institution, but I was more curious what his relationship was to religion and power in England, which was really what the Puritan question was all about, and the relationship between religion and power.
But it also had the social dimension in terms of his family fought against Cromwell,
right,
or at least opposed Cromwell. There's various aspects of the family legend that Cromwell was going to burn down one of their estates, and he ended up, I guess, not burning it down, but took the roof for bullets. And church was in his early childhood. They a church with the various serfs that lived on the manor, and there was one big controversy that took place that actually led to a lawsuit where they had they had this whole I think it was an aisle that was roped off exclusively for the family, and no one ever thought much of it. But then this new pastor came in who had a big problem with this, and then it led to a lawsuit by, I guess, Mosley's father or grandfather, was it, Thomas?
I believe it was his grandfather, yeah. There was an assigned pew for the Mosley family, and he made this statement that wasn't in the, egalitarian spirit of the church, which the family very quickly disputed. So,
and according to his account of it too, it was less an issue of principle and more of an issue of manner. It was how this was handled that caused the conflict and the affront, rather than Mosley basically believed if his grandfather had been talked to privately and reasoned with, he would have acquiesced to what the pastor wanted.
Yeah, so, almost certainly.
From this, I'm getting a character portrait here of Mosley. Seems to be a man that tried to imbue his life as much as possible with traditional English gentlemanry, along with some modernist values, Fabian society and supporting modernist socialist regimes within Europe and so on, a wider European empire. It seems like he tried to approach these problems with an English character in mind. Is that I don't know. Is that based on the facts?
I'm not sure that it is.
Yeah, my impression was slightly different as well.
I think he states this himself, and the biographer also does, that the war, the community of soldiers in World War One was deeply impactful on his psyche. And in the same way, we're going back there again, but the same way it was for Hitler, to see these people who risked absolutely everything and had this feeling of us as in those who had gone to war and them as in those who hadn't.
Right.
And he actually talked about homes fit for heroes after World War One. And this was a rallying call of the Labour Party after World War II, that it was really the duty of the country to look after these ordinary men who had gone and died in their hundreds of thousands for a war that his anti-war stance really came into being for World War II. He was, as we said, he was 18 years old at the beginning of World War One. So he saw it as patriotic duty, as something the English needed to do. And
this reminds me of the story of Tolkien, actually. And both men came back. I think Tolkien was 21 when he went to 21, or in his early 20s. He already had 2 young children, though, 2 of his sons. And when he came back from the war, he was so emotionally traumatized and was isolated and felt isolated. He lived in rural northern England, and he developed, the entire Lord of the Rings mythology and a lot of these books as sort of a mechanism for the English to revive some cultural strength, to feel comfortable in their own, in something that was appealing to them again, something that was quaint and nice. Mosley seems to have come back from the war and thought, well, I have to make sure that never happens again. So instead of a nice, quiet life writing books in the countryside, it's political activism.
He even went so far as to advocate for, in his sort of party platform book, Tomorrow We Live, that those who come from a better station in life by inheritance actually owe the country more. And so he had this sort of notion that if you are given a hand up by birth, you need to offer your services to a higher degree to the nation. And the way he sort of reconciled that was a little bit unclear to me. I mean, he said, like, well, there would be a board of inquiry using common sense to determine what your level of commitment should be, which to me is extremely vague and arbitrary. But he at least had this idea that those who are fortunate or privileged have the noblesse oblige to give their country something in return for that.
Well, it was the way in which the horrors of the war dissolved class consciousness. I mean, it was not only in England that this happened. I mean, that's sort of one of the general causes people point to for fascism.
Very much so. There are references in the Skidelsky biography to when he returned to the trenches after his time with the Flying Corps, and he actually returned to the trenches in no physical state to be there. His leg was very badly injured, so he only lasted a year or so. But he talks of the incredibly awful conditions, and that they didn't really feel this sense of the Germans as an enemy. They saw them as another group of young men sent to die by people who were fools. There's the old line, lions led by sheep, and this is what Mosley felt, and some of that I feel is his natural feeling as a member of the aristocracy, that these middle class, upper middle class men, the products of industry, of banking, of the university system, were just mediocrities. They weren't. He had this desire for heroism, in not just in terms of war, but in terms of a great man who would appeal to the real, like the yeoman of England. And that the professional political class had failed in that duty, and the First World War is this inflection point where the men of the old thinking needed to step aside. You know how I hate to make the comparison because it was so false when he did it, but Obama basically said that old thinking isn't going to work anymore. This is what we need now. And I feel that was a very genuine desire for Mosley, motivated, as we've touched on, by his care and concern for those people, those ordinary people he'd grown up with, and now that he had fought with and seen die.
Well, let's talk a little bit about a few more personal aspects of his life before we get into his early career in politics. Do you have anything, Thomas, on the marriage to his first wife?
Yeah, to Lady Cynthia. So he married Lady Cynthia in 1920. He had already been an MP for a couple of years at this point, but Lady Cynthia was the daughter of Lord Curzon, the Foreign Secretary at that time, and also a man of enormous wealth and influence in the country. There's an interesting sidebar that on her mother's side, there's a rumored Jewish connection for Lady Cynthia, but it's the Skidelsky, the biographer, refutes that, saying she was from Serbian stock, I believe. But it's when you read the name, it's that sounds interesting. The rumor at the time, and it's widely accepted, although I'm not certain by any means, that he married her for his own advancement. Curzon was a made man politically in England. He had met Lady Cynthia while campaigning for Nancy Astor, the first female British MP, and he, by his own account, he was very taken with her beauty and the way she held herself. The fact that she was, he claimed that he was not aware of her inheritance, which I find I'm somewhat skeptical of, because he must have known who her father was. So, and Lord Curzon writes with some amusement in the way he writes. I find it very entertaining about Mosley asking for Lady Cynthia's hand in marriage, and that he had to convince him that this was not for his own advantage, that he was purely loved her and was going to take care of her. And Curzon, being a wise political operator, saw through that saw that Mosley was a young man going places and did not object.
And he joined first the Conservative Party.
He did. When he returned from the trenches in 1916, he was invalided out, and he, as we mentioned, he should never have been there anyway. His background, and he was a very handsome young man with all the right connections, and he made it public that he was committed to a career in politics because of his desire to make change. And he was courted by both the Liberal and Conservative parties. Labour had begun to be a force nationally, but I don't see any mention that Labour courted him openly at this time. But the one thing to consider is the government at that time was a national coalition, as it was wartime. And although it was dominated by the Conservatives, the Prime Minister was Lloyd George, a Liberal. So Mosley was not ever a strident Conservative. He was vetted by the local party in Harrow, where he was first an MP, and was satisfactory more in his manner and his bearing than in his support for conservatism. Conservatism as a psyche, as a policy, was not Sir Oswald's way whatsoever. And it wasn't long. Within 2 years, he had crossed the floor and was away from the Conservative Party, and was regarded as an independent in 1920. The basis for that was his objection to British policy in Ireland, where the rising and the campaign between the IRA and the British black and tans was getting ever more brutal on both sides, and Mosley's contention that the black and tans, which were the British auxiliary troops, and essentially a bunch of ex-soldiers who were over there getting drunk and having a good time, torching farms, was spot on. It was unacceptable behaviour for people who considered themselves gentlemen.
He also opposed some of the British imperial treatment of Indians, and there was, I don't know if this was at the exact same time, perhaps later, but they were like stuffing Indians into cannons and launching them over the ships.
Absolutely, yeah. This was around that time. I think it may have been after he crossed the floor, but he spoke very passionately about the mistreatment of the Indians as part of the British Empire, and there was, especially in conservative circles, who is he to talk of these brown chaps as equals to us? And I don't believe that was Mosley's point. I think he was very much, we say we are bringing civilization. I think he was calling people out on their hypocrisy. But this is so. He actually travelled to India in jumping ahead a couple of years, but 1924.
Isn't that when he had joined the Labour Party?
He had, yeah. He fought 2 elections as an independent in 1922 and 23, and as his positions moved closer to those of Labour and closer to the Socialists and the Fabians, he saw his majority decreasing. So he rightly assumed that there is no way he would win his Harrow seat as a member of the Labour Party, which he joined in 1924. He actually joined the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, which is a party within a party, and was very much the intellectual and most leftist part of the party at that point. So he looked to, there's an interesting sidebar. His first election he fought as a Labour candidate was against Neville Chamberlain, later the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and famed for waving a piece of paper and talking about peace in our time. And
is it true that Chamberlain beat Mosley by a small amount of votes? I'm not exactly sure how the system works there. It's not a direct election from the people, though, so I don't know what those votes constitute. Are they parliamentary votes or?
No, it was a ballot of the people, and the first count, Mosley won by 20. They recounted, and suddenly Chamberlain had won by 77, I think. So,
yeah, that was the number I had as well. Yeah, I guess we can talk about the parliamentary system at another date, but that is quite striking. Yeah, and
yes.
There were accusations that there was vote rigging. I don't know if that's true, but there were accusations, I believe.
More than likely, because this was in Birmingham, which the Chamberlains from Joseph onwards, they ran Birmingham. So to get the machinery in place to influence the election in his favour was certainly not beyond their means. I'm fairly certain there was foul play there.
So what year are we at now?
1924.
Okay, and what is the mood in Britain at that time? Because it was post World War I, obviously. The British and the French and I suppose the Russians, but they're sort of off fighting the revolution, were victorious, and the Germans were not. So this is prior to the Depression, and you would expect that, I guess, the mood of the nation would be somewhat positive. Is that correct, or maybe you can characterize it?
I think it was, if you were fortunate enough to be middle class, to be employed. The economic situation in Britain had declined markedly in the late 19th century. Competition from the United States and from Germany, and a general lack of dynamism, and the feeling that, we have the empire, we are Britain, we started the Industrial Revolution, we have everything under control. But there was an overall decline, which was tempered by a brief period of prosperity just before the First World War. And many politicians after World War I, instead of seeing this as an opportunity to make great change, looked on this brief period from 1910 to 1914 as that's what we need to return to. That's the normalcy that will work for us. And there wasn't any great movement for change or for reform. So the slums, the unemployment, these were huge factors in early 1920s Britain. Although the Great Depression had not sunk its teeth into the world economy, the haves and have-nots, the division had become ever starker.
So perhaps it was more of kind of like a malaise, like in the United States. We had the sort of the 1970s, and I would characterize today, frankly, as sort of similar to that. But it wasn't exactly a precipitous decline into poverty for everyone. It was just sort of, there's, as you say, the lack of dynamism, the uncertainty about the future. And there were a lot of people in the United States, I think, also looking back to prior times to revitalize the nation, not really thinking of new ways to tackle issues of the modern era as well. I hate to make the direct analogy because obviously these are very different circumstances, but obviously our frame of reference is the United States. What exactly were the conservative leaders looking to restore? Like, how did the system that they saw as befitting England work? Was it one of mercantilism or one of free trade or financial capitalism? Because the way Mosley characterizes it is a certain way, and I would imagine the conservatives would not characterize it in the same way. So perhaps you could play devil's advocate and sort of argue what their arguments were for the old establishment line of thinking.
The conservatives were, it's interesting, especially in the current climate with Trump talking about tariffs and protectionism, because the conservatives at this time, they were the party of economic protection. They saw free trade as problematic for the country. They saw there were a lot of imports of agricultural produce coming into the UK from America, from Northern Europe, and they saw protectionism as the way, as one of their key planks, whereas the liberals were the free traders. And Mosley, actually, when he crossed the floor in 1920, became a very much a proponent of free trade, although he completely reversed direction later on. One of the key economic issues, which, as economics always do, go into the social issue, was to return to the pre-war gold standard, and the idea that deflation was the way to achieve that end. And through this, the conservatives saw austerity to a degree, cutting back on DEM programs, although I'm sure they weren't called that at that time, and keeping a very tight control of the public purse, getting back to the gold standard. This would, while essentially they waited for the world market to recover from World War I.
Well, and not just return to the gold standard, but to return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity.
Exactly, yes.
And he said about the gold standard later on, he was asked if he favored a return to the gold standard, and he said, no, gold is a fetish used for its own purposes by international finance. A gold standard and autarky cannot exist together. Right. I mean, he was a Keynesian. Keynes was a major influence on him.
Hugely, yeah, especially leading up to the new party in the early 30s. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and talking about what led to the new party and his resignation from the Labour government, he had a series of proposals that were rejected called the Birmingham proposals.
Yeah, between when he first came into the Labour fold, between 1924 and 26, when he wasn't actually a member of Parliament, he used that time to develop these Birmingham proposals, or as he called them, revolution by reason, where he proposed state control of capital and a rejection of deflation, and as Nick mentioned, the return to the pre-war gold standard. He rejected those as incompatible with the modern world. He wasn't in favor of state control of industry. He propounded an idea of state control of capital. He talks often about the bankers. He talks often about those in control of non-productive capital. He saw almost an alliance of the owners of the means of production, like the industrialists and the workers, against the idle financiers. And it was good stuff. This was revolutionary. He called it revolution by reason, and it really was.
When did he become a proponent of these, let's just call them like corporatist ideas? It's slightly different than the Italian version, I'm sure, but I would say this reminds me a lot of how the sort of Mussolini government was operating, and they were actually much earlier than the Hitler regime as well. So I'm wondering where he's sort of getting his inspiration from, and when is he proposing these ideas? Are we still at 1924, or is this later?
Yeah, this was 24 to 26 was the time of the development of the Birmingham proposals. And when he actually was elected in 1926 to Smethwick, also in the Birmingham area, he is very much, he's not holding back on that these are his positions. And he had vigorous support from a lot of labor activists from far left trade unions. Those who were on the periphery of the Communist Party were supporting Mosley at this time. And when he stood for the election in 1926, this was the time when his father tried to attacked him and tried to bring him down with the criticism that he had never worked a day in his life.
Well, his joining the Labour Party was the final nail in the coffin with his relationship with his father.
Right. Yeah, and the press liked to characterize him as this dandy who was, his wife would be on the podium with him, covered in furs, and he wore this, 200 guinea Savile Row suit is one thing. I've made in 20 guineas at the time. I know that was an awful lot of money. But he was there saying, I am standing for the working man, and I want to control capital. And so it was a basic standard. This man is not what he claims to be. He is a hypocrite. He is a product of wealth and the establishment. And that's how they tried to take him down, but it did not work.
I'll be honest. That was my initial suspicion of him as well, and I'm very much open to being incorrect in that fear. But it begs the question: why is he doing this? I mean, he comes from a family of privilege, and if I could just finish my point, and I often, ask myself, why are people doing things? Because I think it explains ultimately where they usually end up going. And I have a sort of a cynical version of this question answer, and I also can spin it in a positive way. But my fear is that he's doing this mainly just for power, for his personal ego, and I don't know why he would sort of have this visceral connection with the working class. Now, you could say that his experience during the war sort of shaped his experiences that way, and I do believe that's possible. But the way he sort of continued to kind of carry on with these very, I don't know what the word would be, but it just seems to be he's very fancy, and if he's a man of the people, it's not nothing to recognize that people in communist regimes, or like in India, like the Nehru jacket became a thing because it was a very plain looking aesthetic. Yet he still continued to have this very sophisticated elan to him, which does not seem to go well with the working man aesthetic. So, just a question.
He certainly appealed to the working men, and as for fancy, I mean, the uniforms, we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit. The uniforms got a bit more elaborate, but he regretted later. Initially it was just the simple black shirt, and the black shirts arose out of simple necessity of the street fight and identifying friend and enemy in the mob of red and Jewish thugs. But I wanted to answer Adam. I think that's a question that can just be a part of the broader show here. We can get back to it. I want to answer your earlier question about his influences. We mentioned Keynes. Keynes was a major influence on his economic thinking. Another big influence was Oswald Spengler. He wanted to see he wanted to see a modern, what he would call modern Caesarism, to deal with the decline in late stage of Western civilization. So a Caesarism that is not a one man per se, hence the corporatism and the syndicalism, and one that has a union with science and modernism. And this he thought could alleviate the ills of a dying civilization. The other main influence was a Scottish economist by the name of Alexander Raven Thompson. He wrote the book The Coming Corporate State, which was a major British Unio-fascist sort of policy document. And Thompson, he lived till, I think, the early 1950s. He's an interesting writer. Did you have anything, Thomas, you wanted to say on his intellectual influences at the time?
No, I think those are some good points. The influence of Keynes, as you said, I don't think can be overstated. We look now, it's tempting from what ostensibly a right-wing perspective of, Keynes and supply-side economics as something to be looked down upon, but I've never really seen it that way. And he was very much a proponent that the free market, Mosley would not correct itself. There is no. He argued, and rightfully so, that even the left at the time in Great Britain, the Labour Party, still had very much a free market approach to how problems would be solved. You just had to push things in the right direction. And the corporatist view, and that was his answer to these problems. The free market would not correct itself, I think, was a key plank in what Mosley believed.
Well, Keynes and a lot of these figures obviously became much more significant to the public during the Great Depression because the status quo was obviously being called into major question as to the validity of the way it works. And Keynes's ideas were fairly revolutionary in that he saw the government on the sort of demand side as opposed to the supply side, stimulating demand, trying to give the economy reasons to buy as opposed to produce, consume over produce. And that idea was picked up almost wholeheartedly in the United States by the Roosevelt administration and in later years during the difficulties in the United States during the 60s and 70s, and then were later sort of discredited during the 80s by the supply-siders and monetarists. But at the time, in the 20s, I don't know what prominence Keynes had. I know he was considered very brilliant, but I'm curious what people thought of him. And also, I've always sort of understood the theory behind his stuff to be theoretically sound, but in practice, and this is I guess my remaining criticism of it, is that if you give the power of stimulating the economy during downturns to the government, you then trust them to rein in, which I think is what Keynes also recommended as the sort of duality to his recommendations, to rein in their own spending during upturns, which they never do. And this is what seems to create these never-ending government deficits, which add more and more debt to the nation. So that's my sort of particular criticism of it. But I'm curious what people thought of it at the time in the 20s before the Depression, and were people raising those objections?
One of the big problems with Keynesianism is when you have a democratic system.
Right.
You can get that spending into
the
favored industries and the who can agitate. You would need basically total fascism in order to make Keynesianism work more effectively. You would need a state above the influence of money, power, and the mob.
He proposes. I think I'm reading his major essay on the corporate estate, and he proposes replacing the House of Lords with, quote, the national corporation, which would function as an effective parliament of industry. I think that's essentially what you're talking about, right? You need a coalesced organizational body to make this sort of economic policy work. You would have to align the interests of every industry towards a singular endeavor.
Yeah, the state would need to be absolute in that sense.
And he proposed an almost, technocratic solution in some ways. You got the best people from the industries, and the unions would have been heavily involved in that. To say, after the state had taken over the means of capital, i.e., had nationalized banking and lending, who needs the money? Where can this best be spent to stimulate industry, to stimulate demand?
Exactly, and the. Adam, to your question about Keynes's influence, I mean, Keynes didn't write the general theory until I think like 1936. However, the one work of Keynes that I actually really like, the rest is like I can't read that shit, man. His early book that he wrote in 1919, and I do wonder if this was influential to Mosley because it has some foreshadowing to his later thinking for sure, which is his Keynes's The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And that's the book in which he argued that the punitive aspects of the peace treaty at the Treaty of Versailles were damaging to Europe as a whole. It's really quite good. And that book was actually very popular at the time. So I think it's likely that Mosley had read it. And he goes on to start thinking in a much more broader European sense.
Yes,
and of course, about the horrors of war.
Yeah. Sorry, Nick. Yes, Skidelsky mentions that Mosley definitely did read that book.
Oh, okay. Cool.
And that he was involved in this early idea of creating a center party of mainly ex-soldiers who rejected what they called the shibboleths of the old establishment. That was Mosley was very much a believer early on in what the League of Nations might achieve as an arbiter of international strife, and he quickly learned that it was a paper tiger, but he felt, and Keynes's work of 1919 was something that he had read, and that he felt that the just peace was vital to future cooperation, and this passionate conviction he had to avoid any future war. Where in his later, we'll get into this, but where he is interned and where they talk about his support of Nazi Germany, there is no doubt that Oswald Mosley passionately did not want another war and was willing to do whatever it took to avoid it.
To me, that's his greatest legacy from his active political time in the 1930s. Is his anti-war stance.
Agreed.
One of his major, I guess, intellectual influences from this specific paper that he talks about is Arthur Salter, Baron Arthur Salter, who wrote The United States of Europe and a couple other papers and books on the subject of aligning European interests across the continent to avoid another conflagration. Most of his work was published after the war ended, starting in 1921.
Right. Yeah, and he, when we look at especially Mosley's later career, he very much returned to that idea of the European, the National Party of Europe, the Union movement, where there would be this avoidance of petty squabbles and the idea of areas of influence where where the great powers would work together and avoid this economic rivalry, which he felt spurred, through.
Yeah, we will definitely be getting to that later.
Right.
I'd like to pick up where we left off in the timeline here with the creation, his departure from the Labour Party and his creation of the short-lived New Party. Talk about that, Thomas.
Sure. Yeah, so he wins the Smethwick by-election in 1926. When Labour becomes the party of government, he was hoping for a fairly significant position in the new cabinet. But Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, appoints him as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which is pretty much a badge it's a position without portfolio. He's a member of the cabinet, but he's not responsible. One of his duties as a member of the government was to help solve unemployment, and he was very much stymied in his attempts. His position did not lend him to having the influence that he hoped it would, and he brought forward before the cabinet what is known as the Mosley Memorandum, which essentially was a program of protectionism, high tariffs, nationalization of capital, and a program of public works to get people back to work and solve unemployment. There was a very revolutionary statement for the time. The supposed socialist government of the Labour Party rejected it flat out, and at that point Mosley resigned from the cabinet. He attempted to revive this was in early 1929. He attempted to revive the Mosley Memorandum in October at the Labour Party conference, but was once again unsuccessful. There's a general feeling that he's going too far, that he's a man ahead of his time, that the country, the parliamentary system of Great Britain was not ready for this kind of departure. And at this point, this is when Mosley leaves the Labour Party to establish the short-lived New Party. He was supported by a number of other MPs. There was a sizable rump of the New Party in the British Parliament at the beginning of the 1930s. Some notable supporters of the New Party were Nye Bevan, Harold Macmillan, later Prime Minister. And the party was endorsed by that great organ of British journalism, the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
But sadly, the party pretty much ceases to exist as a viable political option in political movement in 1931. An election is called at the onset of the Great Depression. Every single one of the MPs who had joined the New Party lost their seats to the established parties. So in 1931, the New Party is eliminated from the British Parliament. So at this point, Mosley goes on a tour of the new movements in Europe. He is especially inspired by what Benito Mussolini, El Duce, is doing in Italy. There's the famous picture of him standing next to Mussolini in Rome, wearing the black shirt. So I think at this point, Mosley has been characterized as a young man in a hurry. He's still a young man at this point. He's in his mid-30s. He sees this desperate need for change. He sees the Great Depression, beginning to sink its teeth into the economy and the social fabric of Great Britain. And he sees that his attempts to change the system from within have failed, and that if he wants to achieve that which he holds to be important, if we accept, and I certainly do, that he believed in these things passionately, anti-war, he believed in corporatism, he believed in ending the social malaise of Great Britain and the intense poverty that the industrial working class suffered. He saw the only solution as a fascist solution. And that sounds overly simplistic, but if you look at the point of how he arrived there, it's a man who came to politics as barely even an adult, with great beliefs which never dissipated, and tried everything in his power, encompassing 5 parties if you take him as being a conservative. He never took the Liberal whip, but he voted with the Liberals in 1920. Then he's in the Labour Party, then the New Party, and at this point, it's like, well, the only way to do this is to impose it from above. We are not going to get what we need within the current system, and fascism gives us this platform to actually do what needs to be done.
So I'll ask the maybe obvious question: why not communism? If fascism can do this, communism certainly can take control.
It's a good question. Mosley did consider himself a socialist. He's a member of the Labour Party. It's not mentioned, and he doesn't talk about it at all in his autobiography. I believe that Mosley was aware of the Jewish influence on Soviet communism.
Oh, yeah, well, he does. I'm sorry to cut you off, Thomas. He doesn't talk about in his autobiography, but he absolutely does in the alternative.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, no, he mentioned. So the reason, to answer your question, it's the same reason fascists elsewhere were anti-communist. It was anti-European.
Yeah,
he saw it as
it's international. It's international.
Well, not just international, but also of the Orient. He said the two main reasons that communism were of the Orient, in his words, were that it was invented by a Jew, and it was only succeeded to the extent it succeeded at all, in Russia.
Right.
Which, he certainly did not see as a part of European civilization.
Yeah, he characterizes the Slavs and the people of the East when he talked about how Germany might become dominant again if they were allowed to get this to gain power. This was during the First World War, that he characterizes the Slavs as subhumans. So his take on Soviet communism was always, this is something of the East. The Jewishness of it did not escape him.
Yes, and furthermore, I mean, he was opposed to the class war dimension of it, and he was influenced. Keep in mind the influence of Spengler. He saw communism as an instrument and tool of international finance, which Spengler would characterize as money in the mob. He saw money in the mob, meaning, of course, the masters of money, the Jew, as the primary enemy. And yes, he was not very explicit about the Jew in general. That was not really his. And there's some controversy regarding this. Namely, I mean, the British Union Fascists was supported by Mussolini, who also was not necessarily an anti-Jewish agitator, and yet at a certain point in the late, Mussolini withdraws support and funding from the British Union of Fascists.
Well, now that you bring that up, I was actually going to ask Thomas, what is the legality behind foreign, or let alone Mussolini, funding a party in Britain?
Well, before you answer that, let me finish the point, which is that, and then the slack in funding is picked up by National Socialist Germany briefly, and that it has been attributed to that fact that there was an increase in anti-Jewish agitation. But keep in mind too on the relationship between. He understood the ideological, the bigger picture component, the relationship between capitalism and communism, and the funding of international, read Jewish bankers of communism from the West.
Oh, I completely agree. I can go into that too, but Thomas, I was curious about the sort of funding of the BUF from outside sources. Was the government in Britain allowing that, or was that sort of not disclosed to them?
It was not disclosed, and it was very carefully done through a series of fronts and offshore accounts. And Mosley continued to deny it all the way up to his internment, and it's pretty clear it's true. There are records of, especially from Mussolini, essentially bankrolling the BUF when Mosley's money had dried up. So. But it was also used as one of the justifications for locking Mosley up in 1940.
Under the, what was that, like 8FB was the legislation? I forget the exact designation. Absolutely. Yeah. So Adam, actually, I think that's a very good question. I'm going to continue on this for a second because the other, I don't recall if I mentioned it, but the other issue is, of course, class war. And his line, he's very similar to his friend, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, who visited one of the BUF headquarters, I think it would have been before Rivera died, so I guess in the early 30s.
Of the Spanish Civil War that Hans and Nick were kind enough to research quite thoroughly in 2 episodes that we did prior this year.
Yeah, they're largely similar men in a lot of respects. They had a similar political ideology. Of course, the situation in Spain and the situation in England were different situations, but they also are men who came from the upper class. And Primo de Rivera has, I guess, received similar sort of accusations that he was, a wealthy, playboy, flirting with this for his amusement. But he was, in fact, a true believer and a very brilliant man at that. So I would add that class war dimension, and finally the materialistic aspects of communism. He has, in the work I guess we'll get into maybe a little bit later in his post-war work, Europe, The Faith and Plan, he has a concluding sort of chapter. I don't know if it was published at the same time, but now it's available with the book, called The Doctrine of Higher Forms. And that's where he critiques the materialistic aspects of communism as, yes, he was a socialist who wanted to deliver material well-being to the people, but it didn't stop there. He wanted Western civilization to aspire to a higher form of life. He was, of course, heavily influenced by Nietzsche and Wagner and Goethe. He wrote actually a very good piece on the Ring Cycle.
If I could make a point about a lot of the corporatist or fascist movements during this time frame. Majority of them in Europe were tied to the Catholic Church, but overall they were typically birthed by 2 causes: either a lack of industrialization and the demand for further industrialization. So Spain, Slovakia, Czech Republic, parts of Italy, parts of Greece,
Portugal.
Portugal, very much so, and in part, and to an extent, France. The movements that sprung up in England and in Germany, to an extent in Denmark, to a very, very small extent in Sweden, and countries in Belgium, for example, the Rex movement, were the management of existing industrialization. Countries that were part of, the European core, as you could call it, and including the English, had a very different problem in that they were becoming societies rapidly unable to maintain their own scale. They were rapidly unable to maintain living conditions. They had actually regressed in many ways because of rampant industrialization. And they were seeing probably more real class conflict than Spain was in any real sense. Rivera was seeking to prevent class conflict by controlling industrialization. He saw how industrialization worked. in England and Denmark and Germany, and wanted to avoid that because by the early 20th century you have a civil war essentially in Germany. You have small guerrilla battles between communists and establishment types in Denmark and certainly in parts of England. Not as violent. The two primary causes for fascism really in Europe were not as a reaction to communism. I think more and more so it was really how do we manage either the industrialization process or how do we manage what we've built, because we have no idea how to maintain a sort of loosely knit regionalized society with these sort of mass industry projects.
You're right. It wasn't a reaction to communism. It was a reaction to the same things that communism was reacting to, or at least 20th century communism was reacting to.
And in many ways, it was the fall of Christian distributism in not just in England but in Europe. People no longer knew what their place in society was. They couldn't really contend with increasing harshness of reality. So people came up with a variety of possible solutions. And particularly the former states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you saw a pretty diverse mix of different approaches, but they all boiled down to either some kind of Catholic corporatist approach or they were very quickly influenced by Bolshevism.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Hans. I think Mosley and the British Union of Fascists generally, that where they say in their platform they are anti-communist, I think that was more a result of what happened in the streets when they put up the banner and the people who came to fight them. Right. As you rightly say, they were two approaches to the same problem, and in Britain there had been, whether he's talking in code words or not, I don't believe he is. That he talks about the mobility of British capital and its tendency to migrate abroad. It's almost like this globalism argument and the substitution of globalism for Jewish finance capital that we experience now.
And that put England in a very, very different situation from other fascist or emerging fascist countries in Europe. I mean, the only other country that really was comparable in that sense was the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, it was striking in that it never really developed an internal fascist or internal social national movement. The Netherlands was a country essentially through and through, since the 16th century onwards, ruled by the same sort of quasi-establishment class. But there was never really a homegrown fascist movement. And I think that might have been part of the problem with England as well, is that this idea of global capital changed their possibilities. From Spain was relatively isolated, and what went on in Spain could be contained. But if England went fascist, there would be so many interests trying to undo it or trying to invert it into something different because of how important it had become.
Right. I mean, that was one of the big arguments in favor of free trade, was that the very nature of the British economy, and that it had started industrializing before anyone else, was that it had exported its know-how, and that and now other people had it and could do it cheaper. There wasn't this alternative to look inwards and to say, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. We're so entrenched in the global system that there's no way out.
Go
ahead.
One other aspect about the opposition to communism is communism was, of course, recognized for what it was at the time, which is the international component of it, the Communist International. And it was seen, I mean, fascism was seen, he mostly saw fascism for England as an expression of nationalism, right? And so, again, this was sort of the layman basic reason that you would be a socialist and you would go with the fascists rather than the communists is because you were a patriot. And he came, of course, to sort of regret the ultranationalism of fascism. He said at one point later on, and it's after the war, in his retrospective look at this, was that if there had been the fascist international that was, rumored to exist by the financiers and the people in charge of the Western governments, the allied governments, the war could have easily been averted. And so he actually came to regret what he would call the ultranationalist character of fascism, for being the great obstacle to what could be achieved in a broader in a broader movement, what he would call the European idea that would be able to restore and preserve European civilization against the outer barbarism of, again, mob and money.
I wanted to ask Thomas about his knowledge of the origins of the banking power in, let's just say, the city of London, if not all of London and the broader UK. If you look into the creation of the central bank in the United States, it was largely due to some very powerful bankers in the United States in alliance with a lot of European bankers who were predominantly Jewish. And that happened around 1913, which happened to coincide with the introduction of the income tax. But without going into the whole spiel about what the Fed is today, the Bank of England has been around for much longer. It was actually founded in the 1600s, and the role it plays in the English economy is a little bit less clear to me. So I would like to know what Thomas's opinion of the sort of role of the central bank and the banking elite in London is as it pertains to the British economic system, because obviously that bank has been around for a long time, and so this is nothing sort of as new as it was in the United States.
Before Thomas answers that, I'd like to make one quick point, which is, funny enough, Mosley admired the United States Federal Reserve, and that's because he is a Keynesian. And
he supported the idea of a central bank, but the Fed is not really run by the people; it's run by owned by the private banks. A lot of people don't know that.
I'm not suggesting that there's per se something wrong with the abstract idea of central banking. It's how it's implemented and who implements it, and that seems to be a bit of what he missed.
There is a corporatist element to it. It is essentially a national corporation. It's chartered by the government, but its primary input is from regional banks with their own charters. So it really is a public-private partnership with, I think it's 13 subdivisions, right? 13 regional subdivisions across the country. So it makes sense as opposed to
in theory,
the Bank of England, which is a centralized institution in London.
The U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its value since the introduction of the Fed.
Right.
Prior to that, the United States dollar was much more stable. It never saw this inflation that the Fed has overseen. So their track record is horrible, in my opinion.
And it defeats the whole point when it's money power and the capitalists and international financiers who control this bank. The whole point from a fascist perspective would be that a state that represents the will of the actual people, of the European people, of the people of the given nation, would be in control of capital. But it's quite the opposite when that. I mean, in form, maybe it is exactly what he'd want. And that's probably why I admired it. But he'd have to peek a little under the surface to see what's actually going on there. And he probably wouldn't be so enamored with it. But Thomas, did you want to comment on Adam's question regarding the role of the City of London and Bank of England? And
Sure. I think, Nick, you're absolutely right in terms of the way Mosley looked at the Fed. We touched on that the nationalization that he favored was of capital. He thought the government should control the means to lend to industry and to the people, and so he saw that theoretically as a good practice. But as you said, peek under the hood, and it's not what you see. In terms of the Bank of England, I think if you look at the same time frame of the early 20th century onwards, to look at it as doing anything particularly different from the Federal Reserve I must confess this is not my primary area of study or expertise, but it is certainly run by the same people for the same interest and bears the same amounts. The governor of the Bank of England has some autonomy from the government, but when we regard, Labour and Conservative as it stands now, in the same way that establishment Republican Democrat are essentially the same thing, the Bank of England has always been a vessel for advancing the desire for the capitalist global system to prevail.
Well, today, I don't know how it was at the time back in the 20s, but the global nature of the central banks, with perhaps the exception of China, is very apparent. I mean, basically the countries that defeated the Axis during the Second World War effectively work in unison. The European Central Bank, the Bank of London, the Japanese, the Americans, the French, I guess that's through the European Union now, but they effectively coordinate all of their policy maneuvers. And if you talk about world government, I mean, what's more significant to everyday life than money? So I see this sort of international nature of the banking system writ large today. At the time, I don't know exactly how it was operating, but there were certainly moves by the people who set up the Fed to establish this stabilizing factor into the economy. At least that was their ostensible argument. Now, the track record doesn't show that even happened, but that was the sort of argument that Paul Warburg was writing in his little paper that he then actually had to come and explain to Congress after this thing was implemented, because people had some questions about how the hell this thing even got into place by this guy who wasn't even a U.S. citizen when he first arrived, and then he suddenly becomes, monetary advisor to rewriting the entire country's policy, because he's coming from Germany, from the Warburg family, which is probably second to the Rothschild family in terms of European banking houses. So, NWO, whatever you want to call it, both of them, yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of international nature is pretty well proven by the evidence.
Yeah, the Rothschilds were doing business in London, I think in the 1600s. So it's followed that path. I mean, especially when British industry and exploration, when we came to the beginning of the global economy, any semblance of the Bank of England working for British interests, other than a very select group of Britons who we could possibly regard as dual citizens, the interests of the British people were long since gone, I think, in the mid-1800s, if not before.
Certainly, and Mosley makes a very cogent point when he says that if you look at the sort of behavior of the London Stock Exchange, it mirrors the behavior of the New York Stock Exchange more than the behavior of the British economy, which is pretty absurd. I mean, if you think about it, it's supposed to be serving the capital needs of the British people as opposed to the speculative class of the international banking and finance elite who are essentially operating on a global stage. And he basically says that, he's not against finance, but it has to be in the service of the people, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we go here into the on-the-ground stuff that was happening on the street level in the 30s with the BUF?
Sure. So the British Union of Fascists was actually an amalgamation of some existing fascist movements in Britain, mainly concentrated in London, but not exclusively.
Wasn't it East London that made up the bulk of the support?
It is. East London is now basically occupied territory.
Yeah, it's Muslim now, but it used to be like the working class dock workers, right?
Exactly. I lived in East London in the early 90s, and this is when I became very much involved in right-wing politics. But yes, it was always the place where it was the working class. This is where the slums were in London. So obviously East London was where Jack the Ripper plied his trade. This was, the working class. The docks came into East London. It was. It's always been a redoubt of working class right-wing militancy since that came to be a thing. And it's interesting because this was the only area where the British National Party was able to achieve any electoral headway in the 90s. Was exactly the same place as where the BUF did its best in the 30s. So,
and at the height of the BUF, it was something to the effect of, I think, 50,000 members.
Correct, but some active members, Mosley claimed that there were at least 500,000 who had passed through its, its meetings or its membership. And he may well be right.
Well, there's evidence to support that could be true, which is the outdoor meeting that he had in, I forget what park it was, but that was about 230,000 people, and the largest indoor meeting, I think, was like 30,000. I could be wrong.
Yeah, the Earl's Court rally just before the war started in 1939 is the largest indoor political meeting that's ever taken place in Great Britain, and still is.
And so I guess we should address the black shirts and the symbolism, etc. He was asked, if you do not copy foreign ideas, why do you, 1, wear the black shirt, 2, use the Italian fascist salute, and 3, use the Italian fasces? I should add that if I'm not mistaken, the original symbol was simply the fasces. Is that right?
Right,
Thomas. And then he moved for the symbol of the organization, he moved to, of course, the iconic flash and circle, which were meant to symbolize, national action, unity, and violence of action. So in response to these questions, I'll read it, I guess, at length because it's worth mentioning. We wear a black shirt because the color black best expresses the iron determination of fascism and the conquest of red anarchy. Symbolism in itself is nothing new in British politics. The Conservatives, who are naturally rather shy about their creed, wear a modest primrose once a year in memory of Mr. Disraeli, Jew. The Liberals wear rosettes of varying hues at election time. The Socialists wore red ties until they faded pink after the last Labour government. In symbolism, as in our creed, we are more full-blooded people and literally, as well as metaphorically, have put our shirt on fascism. Our members are not compelled to wear the black shirt. In most districts, only about 1 in 20 wear it. But those who have worn the black shirt in the early days and publicly proclaimed their faith before the world have performed a service to fascism which will never be forgotten. Strongly held opinions, strongly expressed, are a necessity in the chaos of a flabby age. The black shirt, therefore, is the symbol of fascism. Now, 2, in response to the question regarding the Italian fascist salute, the salute is not Italian, nor is it German, but the Germans also use it. It is the oldest salute of European civilization and was used early in Britain, many centuries before a fascist party was created in Italy. And as for the fasces too are a symbol used in Britain for the last 2,000 years and are to be found on most of our great monuments. The symbol was brought to Britain by our Roman ancestors who were here for centuries, and their stock remained forever. The fasces were the symbol of the Roman Empire, and what more fitting than that they should be used by the empire which succeeded and surpassed the Roman Empire. And to comment on that last bit, that's a theme that pops up actually a lot in Mosley's writing, is the ways in which he traces what he saw as the best in English civilization, both to the Hellenic world and to the Roman world.
Yeah, that is interesting when you consider, a lot of the rhetoric of the far right in Britain has been talking about the our Anglo-Saxon heritage. That wasn't really Mosley's at all. So yeah, I'm interested. I really enjoyed the where you read about the black shirt. I really wished that was happening now, and the memes of nobody cared who I was till I put on the black shirt would be truly extraordinary. But sadly, we were not born in that time.
The black turtleneck. I mean, I think that when just as a humorous aside, I guess, I think when I first heard of Mosley, it had been 4 years ago. And when I looked him up and I typed in the name and I see him and hit 4 of his compatriots all in turtlenecks kind of in this triangular formation walking, I immediately started laughing. I thought there's no way that this had to have been some kind of like small movement of like 100 guys or something. And then you realize that was actually he started a fashion trend for a while. I remember reading that took off for some reason. That became a popular fashion that was not really well known in England at the time.
It was on that note. It was amusing. There were a few chaps in the late teens and early 20s wearing the black turtleneck in the early 90s, much to the amusement, or not amusement, the disbelief of most of the Indian Asian population of East London. They wondered what we were up to, but maybe they've worked it out now.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, like, also black. I mean, most people have a black shirt, so it's you're not asking a lot for people to. They don't need some kind of elaborate uniform. Although that did come later, and he mentioned in his later interview, there's an interview he did with the degenerate William F. Buckley on his firing line program. And though the audio and video is not available, I was able to find like a 1-minute clip, but you can find the transcript online. It's a very funny interview, and it proceeds exactly as you would expect, with Buckley giving great deference and concern to the Jew as the primary legacy of the relevant questions of fascism in England in the 1930s, which again, it was not the big thing. Like they had like a Jew as a Jewish boxer, like a boxing champ, as one of the early trainers for the boys,
right?
And several actually significant Jewish supporters. Though, as the 30s progressed, that shifted, and not the least of which was because of the heavy Jewish presence amongst the communists who were attacking the meetings. And that's, I guess, the dynamic we should really explain now is the street fighting and how this came about.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, the BUF was not about getting the Jewish question solved. It was about the economic and political
correct
lack of motion in the British society. And it turns out that a lot of the things that they were criticizing happened to be dominated by Jews because of their nature and orientation towards those types of activities, mainly the media. He was mostly a big critic of the press and the financial world. And I'm sure they punched above their weight in the political scene at the time. I don't have raw numbers on that, but I would not be surprised if it was, if not as bad as in Germany or in the United States today. I'm sure it was above their proportion to the population. And it also serves to be mentioned that 50% allegedly of the attackers of the BUF during their street marches were Jewish. And again, that's way above their percentage of the population. So if you were not explicitly targeting the wolf population as you walk through the forest, but the wolves start attacking you, you'd be pretty stupid not to actually take notice of the wolves. So that seems to be what was going on, as far as I could tell.
And Adam, that's precisely what Mosley said about it, because, I mean, he walked a difficult, after all this came to pass, he walked a difficult line in the post-war years in the part of British society that he occupied. I mean, in his autobiography, he doesn't really denounce. I mean, he has his regrets about how this should have been handled, and he had changes in his world outlook. Not the least of which is his pivot towards broader European political unity. He was always for European unity, but then he became much more interested in explicit political unity in form of European imperium. But yes, that's how he's characterized it. That's how he characterized it when Buckley was asking about it. It was like, look, I criticize these people as they're not exempt from criticism, and they keep popping up as a group to attack us, and so followed suit.
Yeah, the stated platform of the BUF was that they were anti-communist, anti-Zionist, nationalist, and protectionist, but they were explicitly stated that they were not anti-Semitic. And as you rightly say, Nick, this really came to be a response to the attacks on the BUF's meetings, which were overwhelmingly Jewish and communist, or both in most cases. So to touch on the overrepresentation of Jews in British society, they were to an extent excluded from actually being in Parliament. Not officially, there were, but they, when we've all seen the graphs of the current American system, this is the percentage in the Supreme Court, this is the percentage in the Senate, and so on and so forth.
The Federal Reserve, the banking system. I mean, it's
exactly.
just it's like the Echo meme is actually pretty apropos, because
it really is.
It literally happens everywhere and all the time throughout history.
But the overrepresentation in Britain was very much in the civil service. Around this time, and still is. So what's interesting is in 1935, so this is a couple of years after the establishment of the BUF, Mosley says, for the first time, I openly and publicly challenge the Jewish interests of this country, commanding commerce, commanding the press, commanding the cinema, dominating the city of London, killing industry with their sweatshops. Sounds like at that point, he had begun to hate, shall we say. So this followed the violence at the meeting in Olympia the previous year, which really started the campaign of all of the press instead of just most of it, to demonize and vilify Mosley and the BUF. It happened around the same time as the Night of the Long Knives in Nazi Germany, and was characterized as, an extension of the same philosophy. These are fascists. Violence is what they do. When it was clear that it was a similar situation to what happened in Charlottesville. If you want to draw a modern parallel, that people went there and it would have been peaceful, but an astroturfed movement of communist Jews, and in our case, trannies and drug addicts, went to break it up.
Thomas, I mean, the point should be restated too, that this is an organization that is very much against war, and Churchill's just here is saying basically, these are violent fanatics. Hold my scotch while I wage a war of extermination against Germany.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the more I read, because I mentioned earlier that I read the Mosley biography over 20 years ago. Rereading it, the way that the press dealt with Mosley and his supporters, and to the way they deal with us now is frighteningly similar. And to me, if I'm getting too off point, please reel me in. But I see Mosley as like who I'd like Trump to be. Someone who's more presentable, who's a great orator, who actually can can say this is our guy, and he wants peace. He wants the things that we want, and he's able to present them in a way that is truly inspirational.
Oh, and Mosley did certainly have a way with the average man. I mean, there were members of his social sphere that were involved with the BUF, but of course the majority of the foot soldiers, so to speak, were poor men from the working class.
They were indeed. He, as we mentioned, he got his support from the working class, and the biggest concentration was in the East End of, which has been the base for any kind of far right activism in Britain. Although that is moving to many cities as the invasion and colonization of Great Britain continues and spreads beyond London.
So, go ahead, Nick.
We should maybe take a brief detour here to talk for a little bit about the Mitford sisters.
Right.
Oh,
absolutely.
Okay. And at some point, I'd like to talk about some of his reasoning behind the fascist, nationalistic economic policies outside of the banking structures, which we've talked about. But we'll come back to that.
Sure. Well, the Mitford sisters, they are characters. You have, of course, Unity Valkyrie Mitford, who.
Did she give herself the middle name, or was that a family thing?
No, that was a family name. She was conceived, by the way, in the Canadian town of Swastika, Ontario.
You gotta be kidding me!
I'm not kidding.
Jesus,
it's true. It's true.
She was named that way because her parents were they wanted Anglo-German unity. So
wow, this goes deep.
Yeah, it goes deep. And so, of course, Oswald married her sister, Diana. Unity, just as a brief aside, there have always been like rumors that she was a potential mistress of Hitler. Because she moved in the 30s, she moved to Germany and to Munich. And
yeah, I think that's how Mosley got the meeting with the Germans. I don't think he ever met Hitler, but it was basically through
he met Hitler. Was a guest of honor at his wedding in the home of Joseph Goebbels to Diana.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he definitely met Hitler. There's not. Yeah. I don't think there's any pictures of them together, but they definitely met.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, he married the lovely Diana, who you can find. There's some really amusing posts. I think.
Well, explain what happened too, because his wife had died somehow. But this was
right. Thomas, do you want to?
They had an affair before that.
Yeah, she was his correct. She was his mistress prior to their being married.
Yeah, Mosley had at least 3 mistresses that are on record, but Diana was his mistress at the time of Lady Cynthia's death in 1933, and he did marry her in pretty quick. Well, no, it was 3 years afterwards. To be fair,
6.
Yeah, but he was with her pretty much immediately. There wasn't any kind of tasteful gap. So yes, Diana was his mistress. Lady Cynthia, though, was always an ardent supporter of Mosley. She never deserted him. She never turned her back on him. And I always feel a certain sympathy for her because Diana and obviously Unity are such incredible characters, and this connection to the Third Reich is very striking. That Lady Cynthia kind of gets forgotten, but she was always an absolute rock and always at his side, no matter what which path he chose. So I always have a great fondness for Lady Cynthia, and I always like the idea of her swathed in robes defending the socialist platforms at the beginning of the end of the 1920s. I always found that rather amusing. But yes, Diana married in October 1936, as Nick mentioned, in the home of Joseph Goebbels. And she, through Unity, that she had a connection a significant connection with Hitler, and there's something about Mosley looking for a license to have a radio station in one of the I think it was on Sark, which is an island north of Scotland, where Hitler was going to support that, and that was apparently due to the interventions of Diana and Unity. So I think they had really significant connections with the Nazi regime, but in terms of Mosley, he was more personally close and connected to Mussolini, and he saw Mussolini as more of an example to follow.
Yeah, there's I don't know if you've seen it, Thomas, but it's on YouTube in edited form. It's not the full version, but a movie that came out in '98 called Mosley characterizes that sort of dichotomy between the Mitford sisters and Mosley with regards to the different fascist leaders on the continent. Don't know how accurate it is, but it seems to be somewhat fair, at least in that regard, in terms of distinguishing between the two. It seemed to be characterized by the movie as mainly regarding the Jewish question. I don't know what other nuances you can add to that, but it's a worthy movie, if nothing else, to put the context together, because I think it's presented fairly well and somewhat objectively from what I would expect from a mainstream outlet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's it's like surprisingly fair in the fact that when you come to look at portrayals of far-right historical figures, you expect complete annihilation. And
yeah, they have like the sinister music playing on occasion, but other than that, you have some sympathy for him. He's not portrayed as a complete villain,
right? Because there's a more recent biography of him that came out by I think it's Stephen Dorrell. Someone Dorrell. I give him the attention he deserves, but I would advise anyone to avoid it as far as they can. It's basically a character assassination with very little historical significance. If you want to do a biography of Mosley, the autobiography is good, but Skidelsky's work is definitely worth a look.
So, Nick, what were your thoughts on the Mitfords?
Well, I just thought that they bared mentioning. I mean, he was married to Diana up until he died first, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Because she lived to be 93. Died in 2003. No, that's all I want. I just wanted to get into them briefly. Adam, you wanted to discuss a bit more of the economic platform of the BUF.
Yeah, so I'm always interested in sort of economic models. I suppose in the abstract, if mainly because I'm so disillusioned with anything ever changing in practice. But it's worth discussing that this was somewhat of a fresh approach to the sort of neoliberal international trade system that we seem to be living under. And the way he diagnosed the problem was essentially he saw the banking elite or just the sort of the profit-oriented elite, at least in the UK, choosing the foreign worker over the domestic worker for reasons of cost. And the, I guess, concern was that, and we can see this clearly in all Western countries after the fall of communism, especially with all the cheap labor opening up with the formerly communist nations now, opening their markets to foreign investment. But at the time, the British Empire had dominion over India and parts of Southeast Asia, and weirdly, they were doing a lot of trade with Japan, which was industrializing rapidly. And actually, the textile industry in Japan was the predominant industry that propelled Japan to its rise. And some of that was actually not coincidental. They studied the European models, particularly Britain and Germany, and they chose the textile industry as an industry to grow their economy because the British had the Industrial Revolution was arguably built around that industry initially. So they were experiencing in Britain a lot of foreign imports, like we are from China today, from places like Japan. And Mosley characterized this as sort of coolie labor, and it was obviously coming at the detriment of the British worker. And so he saw the empire as actually an opportunity for Britain to go back to the sort of mercantilist system of having manufacturers in Britain being used as ways to pay for the raw materials that they import. But it would be done on a way that was somewhat equitable to the Dominion colony areas as well. It would only be done to the point where they were in balance. It wasn't necessarily to exploit or leverage one over the other, which is somewhat unique as well, as opposed to the mercantilist model, which was more about sort of beggaring thy neighbor, of trying to maximize your net exports rather than having things in balance. Today, we're told deficits don't matter, but clearly if you look at the financial situation of the Western world, it's much worse than it was if you look at the debt levels and the unfunded liabilities and whatnot. Which reach into the trillions. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. And the answer is we need to borrow more. And so you have to ask, who's suggesting those sorts of strategies. But his strategy was much more industrial-based and worker-based, which I would applaud. And he also was oriented much towards raising the wages of the worker, and not to eliminate competition, but to essentially make sure that the distribution of wealth was much more equitable, and that's sort of a subjective term, but much more even. Let's just put it that way in a more objective terms. So he advocated for a minimum wage, but also the oversight of industry by government to make sure that they're not moving industries outside of the country, where basically his policy was if the British can make it, it should be made in Britain, no matter the cost, which you can maybe debate on things that maybe are orders of magnitude more expensive, but I think the social benefits probably outweigh whatever the cost increase would be, given that you don't have the slums, you don't have the unemployment, you don't have the social unrest and difficulties that we all know about today with the drug abuse and things like that. And the problems of the time were essentially the man could not support his family, which were much larger than they were today, given the lack of birth control and different social culture regarding having families back then. So that's what I wanted to say. I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. But it was a truly worker-oriented system that he advocated for.
The drive was for autarky. And again, he came to sort of revise this after the war into a more, he wanted European autarky rather than British autarky.
Well, after the empire had gone away, I mean, I guess that's all you're left with. But
he wasn't particularly. I mean, his opinion on the empire, he wasn't per se against the empire, but he recognized that the empire had gone, and he recognized also the key insight from the so-called allied, European perspective was that, you win the war, but yet you're in the position of a conquered nation.
No, certainly. I mean, what I was describing was from his book "Tomorrow We Live," which was written in 1938, and so that's obviously prior to the end of the Second World War and the dissolution of the British Empire shortly thereafter, effectively in the 50s and 60s with decolonization.
No, I think he's one of the first thinkers that I'm aware of, and where he actually talks that the doing business cheaply and getting the best price cannot be the prime mover, and that the quality of life had to come first. And we see some of those arguments happening today, and I found it touching in a way. I mean, I know in my prior political development, I was looking at, that's so naive. It's always got to be the cheapest goods. Have got to have primacy in the marketplace. But to see someone who was actually aware of the fact that, so what, that they can make it cheaper in Asia, our people are going to be out of work if we do this. We can make it. We should. And I know we talked about it a little bit the last time we were together. You know, when you drive around America and you see all these small towns and their mills shut down, to me that's heartbreaking.
Oh, it's abominable. I mean, I don't understand these people who live in these big cities who can seriously take themselves seriously without trying to understand what the rest of the country lives like. I mean, I guess they truly believe of themselves as like this cosmopolitan elite that they self-congratulate themselves with. I just find that absolutely disgusting. And if you do travel, you will see the poverty that exists. And I just don't understand why people truly don't have a problem with that, because it affects them. You know, the issues that the symptoms that we experience are usually very simply caused by people being frustrated in their lives, and then they end up doing things that are antisocial, things that are related to crimes and drugs and things that are harmful mainly.
Well, if only these hollow logging towns could be able to read Ayn Rand, then I think things would be better.
I mean, it's unfortunate that you can't necessarily look to them for the solution, because it's really out of their control and their power. But it would be nice if the people who are suffering had some means of addressing it. And I think that's the major crime of our system today, in that we delegate all of these powers to people who don't care about us, who don't know about us, who don't really want to do anything about us. And I am somewhat cynical of centralized powers, because it's rare that you get someone who's genuinely concerned with the people, and oftentimes they just pay lip service to get into power. But there are occasions where it happens, and in those occasions you can, in theory, do better if you have some centralization, because then you can coordinate and do greater things than just the sum of the parts. But it's very hard. It's very hard.
Well, but without a central state, how do you prevent the local logging barons from importing their goods from China?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. That's the problem with libertarians. They don't see the reality of people doing things that are harmful to the whole, even though individually, you know, the transactions may benefit both sides. There's a lot of externalities that go along with that are not solved by market forces.
Any kind of protectionist or autarkic scheme would require a central state. But you want to talk about the suppression of the BUF?
Yeah, I do, and I also, before I forget, I was asked a while ago to bring this up, and I thought this show would be more appropriate, given it's related to a British fellow by the name of Jez Turner, who was imprisoned, as Mosley was. That's the reason I bring it up now, for basically criticizing, I believe it's called the Shamrim, which is a exclusively and uniquely racial police force, Jewish police force in Britain, and I think the only police force that has that legal right to do so. But he was a military veteran, and he was put in jail for criticizing it under the British race laws.
Not just Turner, but you also have Joshua Bonehill, and who's that redheaded fellow? Thomas?
Couldn't tell you.
No, I'm struggling. I know who you mean.
Yeah, Lawrence Burns.
Right.
Yeah, and Alison Schablitz. Yeah, I mean the Jesus, man. I mean modern UK really is like a dystopian Jewish hell state. I mean it's just a nightmare.
Right.
I don't know what. I mean, I think Jez is out now, isn't he?
It could be, but the fact that he went to jail for just basically saying, you know, why are these people allowed to have their own police force, you know, when the British police force are supposed to be serving everyone, you know, it's a valid question. You know, it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. It just so happens again to be run by Jews, and so of course these are the people that are excluded from ever being questioned in anything. That's the absurdity of I think what people who dislike Jewish behavior come to. It's the hypocrisy and the double standard and the elitism of that group, if I may say.
Of course, that's every time. That's what gets people upset about them, especially nowadays.
Every single time.
Yeah, without fail. Yeah, no, I mean, it's absurd, man. Yeah, Jez is a good dude.
He is, yeah.
Let's talk about the suppression of the BUF by the British state. If I remember correctly, the initial move against them was the banning of the black shirts.
Right. The Public Order Act of 1936 essentially banned political dress, but was very much aimed at the black shirts. It was aimed at the BUF.
Yeah, because part of the issue was they were successfully defending themselves against communist and Jewish violence, and that had to be stopped. Yes,
absolutely. They were always outnumbered. I guess we can touch on the Battle of Cable Street, which is
please.
This is where the BUF legally asked for permission to march through London and were confronted by a mob of Jews and communists in Cable Street in northeast London. This has been characterized there's actually a historical plaque at the site saying that this is where the residents of East London said no to the fascists,
and they said yes to communism.
Yeah, he said yes to communism and Jewish domination. Yeah, absolutely. No, the people who actually lived there supported Mosley. Not saying every single one of them, but most were in support of the BUF. And this was not a spontaneous outburst of the public being outraged at the beastly fascists marching through their streets. It was a movement by Jewish capital and their communist pets to cause violence. They outnumbered the fascists. I believe it was 4-1, maybe more, and the black shirts held the line, which is that's not how you're encouraged to think about it at school. But I remember at the time thinking, "Good lads, well done."
Well, of course, you see the same tactic today. I mean, they bus in their communist agitators from wherever they can, dig them out of the whatever rock they're living under, and then the media, of course, reports this as the locals rising up in indignation against the skin haters.
Yes, absolutely. It's the parallels with stuff happening now, Charlottesville, etc. They're very marked, and what happens in England as well. Whenever there's an English Defence League or now #Free Tommy or whatever it is.
I'm actually curious, Thomas, what you think people who are on the street, which I, to a degree, appreciate. I don't necessarily agree that it's the smartest thing to do, but if they're going to do it, let me just ask it this way. What would you say to my assumption that Antifa's main role is to basically agitate them into doing something that can be caught on camera or legally prosecutable, which is exactly what's happening in Charlottesville, the people who went, and get the people who were trying to be peaceful to then be smeared by the system. What would you say to people who are on the street? What would be your advice?
That's exactly what I couldn't agree more. I was involved in street politics in the 90s. Street politics is a very fancy way of saying we went out in the streets and liked to fight people. And it's the adrenaline rush and the feeling that you're actually achieving something. You have to get away from that, because even then we knew if any of us got arrested, we were done in terms of our future as a viable member of society. I mean, it wasn't we were not revolutionaries. We were people who wanted to, who didn't like what was happening around us. And we also, this was a movement very much born from the football hooligans. These are people who are good at fighting, who do it for fun, do it for sport, and are good at it. And when they were confronted with leftists, they would plow through them with very little trouble. And that seemed like a whole bunch of fun in the 90s, and we weren't living in the world that we live in now. The people who confront our guys, they don't care about getting hit and getting hurt. They're probably, most of them are so high they wouldn't even feel it.
They want to get hit, because then that is evidence to show, quote unquote, show that the street fighters, or whoever is on the right, effectively, who is anti-system, ultimately, are bad. So that's the trap. That's the trap, and I think people need to be very careful about falling into it.
This may seem like a kind of mundane point, but I might as well make it. I mean, the difference between then and now is that this was necessary. The street presence was necessary in order to do two things. A, be able to communicate at all. This was how the message was going to be delivered this way. This is how he could talk to people. So the street presence was necessary. I mean, it's the same with Hitler. It was necessary to occupy public space and to give speeches in order to communicate the political platform. And second, this was an actual political party that had aspirations. That it didn't. Yes, it failed. They did not get a single MP elected, which is part of the reason, by the way, that Mussolini withdrew financial support. And as a serious political movement, it would need to demonstrate that, as a party, that it need to demonstrate that it could provide that, foundational service of a state force, which is the security for its people.
Right.
Now, if you don't have a party, you don't have a serious political party, and you don't need to go into the streets to communicate a message, then there is no purpose to this.
Right, and the British political system does not lend itself to the kind of movement that we're seeing in the United States right now, where the Republican Party there is potential at a local level for change. I mean, I think at its national level, absolutely not. But the fact that there are all of these various different elections, presidential, Senate, Congress, rather than just the members of parliament who choose the prime minister, there's more possibility for activists to be involved in legal methods of letter writing, online activism, and pushing people locally who seem to be sympathetic to their views to make the right choices.
And in England, basically, you would need a new party, like Mosley created. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you would.
Yeah, and the most they come up with is the BNP, which that didn't work out, and then you have the UKIP shit, which is just gay. Yeah. So the suppression began with the order, the Public Order
Act of 1936.
Okay. Yeah. And so this escalated into what exactly? Because eventually, of course, Mosleyites, as they were called, were thrown in prison. Mosley himself, what was it, BF9? Order BF9? I forget the exact designation.
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, they were thrown in prison. I mean, Mosley and his wife Diana were put into a house on a prison yard, and he was eventually confined to house arrest because he was very sick. But there was also the internment. They were like they used the Isle of Man to intern some of these people in like a giant camp. Is that right?
That's true. Yeah, basically following the Public Order Act, when the BUF took to the streets, it wasn't just the leftists and the Jews and the communists they were fighting. It was also the police, and in some cases, as you said, Mussolini backed out of supporting the movement financially. Mosley's own finances had been drawn down to nothing.
He had to mortgage his family estate, didn't he?
He did, yeah. The probably the final straw was the defection of William Joyce. Lord Haw walked away from the BUF.
I couldn't mention that. So I dug up what's her name, Margaret Metroland over at Countercurrent. She had a small piece on some recent information on that regarding the finances. I've always been fascinated by William Joyce. In fact, if you're ever up for it, I would be happy to. I don't know how we'd incorporate it, but I'd love to do a show just on Joyce because I think he's a very fascinating man. She argued that, because he got basically canned along with like 170 other some members because of that lack of funding, and that it wasn't as much a personal and ideological split as had been previously made out to be. But I'd have to look into that further for the William Joyce, for some William Joyce content. But
yeah, Skidelsky in the biography I've referred to a few times, he characterizes that as a financial situation, not a question of ideology. Although there was this idea that with Mosley being more affiliated to Mussolini than Hitler, and obviously Joyce was very much the opposite. But that wasn't. Yeah, they couldn't pay anybody, so people walked away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Joyce was, of course, much more militantly anti-Jew.
Oh, indeed, yeah. So in 1937, local elections. This was the electoral high point of the BUF. In East London, they got about 25% of the vote. If you look at what the BNP were polling there in the same kind of elections in the 90s, it's very similar numbers, which I found quite interesting, especially considering the demographic change that occurred in those 60 years. There was still this rump of people who no, we don't like this, we ain't having it. And whether they still exist 20 years after that, I don't know, and I don't need to know, thankfully. So we mentioned briefly the Earl's Court rally just before the outbreak of World War II, which was basically a last kind of plea for a negotiated peace. And after that, Mosley also encouraged the British to accept Hitler's peace offer of March 1940. But around this time, it was in 1940 that Mosley and Diana were interned. They were not convicted of any criminal offence. They were just locked away with no trial until November 1943. And after that, they, as Nick said, they were effectively under house arrest anyway. It was mainly due to Mosley's health that he was not interned any longer. But there's an interesting, if you can get the text of it, the questioning of Mosley by Lord Burkitt, which actually makes up an appendix to the introduction to this Skidelsky biography. It's fascinating because in it, it's reminiscent of that Buckley interview, Nick. It's almost Burkitt going, but the Jews, and
yeah, right.
Mosley is just like, well, it's not them, it's what they do, and they only make up 2% of the population, and yet they're driving us to war. Have you been to war, Lord Burkitt? I have, and I didn't like it very much. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he comes across a very sympathetic figure, and you can tell that he's a good debater. He's locked him up.
I might as well just read. I thought this part of the Buckley interview was very interesting, and this is pertinent to the anti-war position and to where Buckley is coming from. So he asks Sir Oswald. He also felt great national and international questions were at stake. Is that true? He's talking about Churchill and the call for rearmament. Because Mosley was calling for rearmament prior to that, just on nationalistic grounds. that England should be armed. But so he says, yes, Churchill started the agitation for rearmament in 1934, according to Liddell Hart, precisely 2 years after I'd begun it. That's one of those things that has to be remembered. I started the agitation for rearmament against any danger which could possibly threaten Britain. That is on record in my own force, the Air Force, which I was in the First War, and mechanized army and navy and everything else. I agitated for rearmament for 7 years, 5 years, 7 years, yes. 7 years before the war, and Churchill began 2 years later. And he goes on to talk about his position with respect to neutrality, and then Buckley interrupts. He says, now wait a minute. You don't say we jumped on his back in order to save communist Russia. You say this surely was a historical byproduct of jumping on his back because we feared his turning west. He's talking about Hitler. Because Mosley's saying, well, you jumped on Hitler's back to save communist Russia, and you can see what became of that. And he has to lecture Buckley for a moment on, he says, you have to consider in politics the effects of your actions. And the effect of that action was, obviously, to save communist Russia. At that time, the collision became inevitable. If we hadn't intervened, communist Russia would evidently have been defeated. And then Buckley whines for a little while. I just thought that was funny.
Well, that was the same defense that Diana Mitford Mosley also gave to an interviewer, her British interviewer, who asked her about, because she had written a book about her life, and asked her about her support of the sort of German Nazi regime. And she said, can you excuse, the 6 million Jews who have perished under Hitler? And Diana basically says, no, I can't excuse it. It's inexcusable. At the time, I had thought it was actually war propaganda, but I've come to the conclusion that it wasn't. But I will say this: Hitler was not unique in killing a lot of people. I mean, the communist regimes have killed much more. She cited Mao. She talked about Stalin, and I think the implication was that basically, why is this obsession placed on Hitler all the time? And I think we know the answer, but it begs the question: why?
Well, I think besides his anti-war position, Mosley was actually thinking in a political way from the perspective of both England and Europe as a whole. And by political, I mean realistically political, actual politics, rather than in the service of other fundamentally non-European powers. Because who can deny, following, as I mentioned earlier, following the Second World War, that England was ruined by this? It ruined the empire. They didn't gain from this. This was a defeat for England. This is a defeat for English sovereignty. They had to bring America into this, and all the ruin and destruction and cost of all of this. And he points out in let's see, what was it? It was the Europe Faith and Plan. He points out that the German, I think he's very right about this, is that the German war guilt had to be pushed heavily in following the war in order to give any justification for what had happened. Because people would look around themselves and say, what was the fucking point of this? Mosley was right. And he also points out that the German war crimes, were committed in the waning days of the war. As he says, crimes in the agony of defeat are ultimately less reprehensible than the methods used during peace to obtain evidence of those crimes, which is a very bold and very true statement. And he's, of course, alluding to the sadistic Nuremberg trials, which were a mockery of European civilization.
Yeah, he's never fully expressive of any kind of denialist ideas, neither is Diana, but I think if you were of their circle and had their confidence, I think you'd it struck me that, especially with Diana, that she certainly did not accept the narrative, the established narrative of what happened in the war.
So let's move to his post-war life and his post-war ideology. So he formulates this is where the Europe as a nation comes up. I mean, it came up beforehand, and the alternative was published in, I mix up because there's two. I think there's two of his works that have the title. He was talking along these lines in the late 30s, but immediately after the war, it becomes more clear. And then Europe, Faith and Plan is in the later 50s, where he forms the idea, I guess, even more clearly and with more hindsight. So, any thoughts on his transition, Thomas, from what you might say the ultra-nationalist fascism to what he, I guess, would say beyond fascism, or you could otherwise maybe say super-fascism, depending on how you want to put it.
Super-fascism, I really like the sound of that. No, he immediately after the war, Mosley moves to Ireland and then actually to
Paris, right?
Yeah. And
he says you can't clean up a dung heap from underneath it.
Right, absolutely. I think his movement towards the National Party of Europe and the Union movement, as he characterized it, were within this framework of spheres of influence, and also very much on his anti-war platform that he'd always adhered to, and you would imagine that he might get some more people on for the ride after World War II.
Well, he was recruiting. I mean, people. He had in particular SS veterans who came on board with the platform.
Right, and so I think there was an element of pragmatism in what he did. As we mentioned earlier, he saw this British economic system being anchored on the empire, which we talked about earlier. But then, obviously, the empire was lost or surrendered, or whichever way you want to look at it, and Britain as an economic entity was smashed, not just by the German bombs, but by its own foolishness. And he saw this need for regeneration throughout all of Europe. I mean, Britain had not suffered to the extent, obviously, Germany, France, and the lowlands, and obviously Eastern Europe, although that wasn't part of this equation. But there was a need for economic and spiritual renewal, and I think he always remained an idealist. He always remained a man of the big project being possible, and he saw this as some way of reinventing himself, because his name was essentially dirt in the UK, and this was a project that was not incompatible with what he had previously stated. Also, the fact that he wasn't possible for him to live in Britain anymore probably motivated some of his feelings towards this National Party of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, he saw it as, he saw what, he came to very similar conclusions as Francis Parker Yockey. However, and Yockey met Mosley too, and they had their relationship was, Yockey actually offered to have Mosley be the author, the listed author of Imperium, which of course Mosley turned down. And there's some debate. Like Diana claimed that he put Yockey's stuff into his, quote, crackpot file, but there's other evidence that they, got along quite well. And it's the relationship was short-lived because the main conflict is they both were looking for a sort of a European imperium, but Mosley was much more sympathetic towards the United States, and Yockey had exactly the opposite position. Ironic, of course, being that Yockey is himself an American, but in my opinion, Yockey was correct and Mosley was wrong, and I think we've seen that proven out by the past 60 years of history. I mean, it's hard to say in hindsight, because Mosley saw the USSR as this great threat, and that America, at least like liberty, some semblance of freedom, quote, freedom, could survive in Western Europe, whereas it would just be some sort of total slavery and hell under a possible communist invasion from the East. But as Yockey would, of course, argue, the East could never really truly conquer Europe in any kind of meaningful cultural, spiritual way, whereas the United States, with the Jewish culture distortion of Hollywood, can have a much more lasting and perverse impact on Europe, and I think that's proven to be true.
Well, to give you an anecdote from today, Thomas, I don't know if you've seen this picture, but there's a fellow who's now the mayor of Sheffield, who I'm assuming is from the West Indies. I don't know where he comes from, but he's an African-looking descending fellow, and he has a sombrero on in a Slav squat in the office of, I guess, the mayor, and he's wearing this black T-shirt that says Donald Trump is a waste man, and he has this ridiculous gold chain, something like you would get in a title bout for a boxing match. And I think he actually wore that outfit to like a hearing of government as well. So talk about culture distortion and the absurdity of the American culture, and as it's spawned its tentacles into the European people's countries. I think this is a very telling example of that.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, when you look at it now, this is the subject, I guess, for another episode at the end of the day, of the transition between NATO opposition to the USSR and NATO opposition to the current Russian Federation. You see that it was never really about communism as the right-wingers believed, or as they believed that it could be used, that the American domination of Western Europe and NATO were in ideological opposition to the true threat of communism, when it was really just a opposition, geopolitical opposition to the one world state that was supposed to be created and that Stalin thwarted. But again, that's a subject, I think, for another episode. The point is here that Mosley took on a European imperial idea for the future, and he came to regret he came to see the ultranationalism of the fascist movements of the interwar periods as a obstacle to what needed to be done to prevent the final decline of Western civilization. And the idea would be, to loosely summarize, it would be, of course, a joint military pact, and there would be political centralization and economic centralization. However, he, of course, wanted to preserve the certain qualities of given European groups. So he was trying to solve this problem and this question. And one of the ways that he proposed to do that is recolonization of Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And I think, politically speaking, one of the most interesting parts of his thinking here was his attitude towards the Arab world. He thought it was despicable how the rest of Europe turned against France when France was trying to maintain Algeria, because he saw that Algeria could have been the bridge to a new Europe-Africa, and that if you leave the Arabs to control the parts of North Africa that they have, and we have the French, that one French foothold, then you can make peace with the Arabs over that settlement, and then you could take the Sahara oil sands, and that would be a European treasure. And he says also regarding the Suez Crisis, I thought was a quotable moment. He said that Arab goodwill was thrown away by the divided nations of Europe in order to compensate British nostalgia for a lost imperial grandeur, and France for wounded feelings at her betrayal in a key position by fellow Europeans. Strangely, he doesn't really mention the Zionism aspect of it, which is actually the entire explanatory factor and the entire way in which the European political future has been thrown off of course by the agitation against the Arab civilization in favor of the Zionist occupation.
Yeah, it's interesting. Suez is something that is taught to English, probably not school children now, because it's probably too complex for current schooling standards. But yeah, we're taught that the Suez Crisis was the time when British domination was officially ended, in the fact that the USA said you need to stop that, and the whole Zionist part of the enterprise is completely overlooked. It's just looked at this twilight of the British Empire and its replacement by the American Empire. And
we're taught the same thing here.
Yeah, it's astonishing. It really is.
Yeah, I found his post-war writing to be interesting. His economic stuff is a little boring, to put it. He spends a lot of time like trying to plot out an economic arrangement. Of course, we see the centralization of economic planning in the current EU. However, of course, this is an instrument by the parasitic classes, and it's obviously not in the notion of a European unity, because they wouldn't be importing the entirety of the brown world into Europe if that was the case. So I think similar to the whole central banking thing, it's like in form it appears similar to what he would want in terms of a united Europe, a European project, but it's perverted by the people, by the true ideas and purpose behind it, and who stands to gain from it. So I guess reflection on Mosley. I mean, we've gone on for a while. What do you guys take away from the life of a very interesting man?
I think he was a man of action. I think he wanted to actually see action in the government rather than talking, which is a refreshing thing to hear, at least. Whether or not he would have been able to implement the things that he wanted to implement is an open question, but I think some of his ideas are worth considering.
Yeah, I think he's a man of great sincerity. I, like Adam, I looked on him first as an imposter in a working class world who wanted purely his own power and his own gratification. I think his experience in the First World War deeply shaped him. I think his experience as a lord of the manor was made him favour a real caring paternalism, and he wanted things done, and he was deeply frustrated by the sclerosis in the political system in the 30s. I would hate to imagine how he would look at it, how it is now.
A fight for action. A fight for action. A fight against the forces of drift, of despair. A fight for action. A fight for action. A fight against the forces of drift, of despair. A fight for vigor, for vitality and manhood. True democracy only begins when the will of the people is carried out.
We say at last that we've had enough of the old men and the old ways, and we are going to have a new movement for the new age in which we live. The worldwide fascist movement has made a new advance in Germany. They have reached power after polling over 17 million votes in a general election. And we believe that Britain, where our British Union of Fascists has already advanced at a record rate, will be the next country to give fascism a chance.
London, 5,000 fascists rally to their mobilization for the much advertised march through the East End, and Sir Oswald Mosley, black shirt leader, arrives at Royal Mint Street to inspect his followers. Communists, Labourites and Jews jam the fascist route, resisting the peaceful efforts of the outnumbered police to clear the way. 6,000 police are already concentrated in the area. Others are rushed to reinforce them.
We were in a fight. I should not expel every man who was fighting with Jews in the street, particularly if they attacked us with razors and other weapons. We were in a fight. That's why we wore uniform, in order to deal with men like this who broke up our meetings by organized violence. And of course I would not expel black shirts who fought Jews in the street when they were attacked by Jews. What I would expel is a man who went around saying that we should deal with all Jews in a horrible fashion, ill-treat them or bully them. Not at all. We were fighting Jews for one reason, to stop a war with Germany. We were in a fight.
What's all that business?
But don't you know what that is? Don't you know what that is? Don't you know what that is? That is a salute 2,000 years before Hitler was born. All the movements of Renaissance in Europe adopted the European salute. And because we were fighting against people who gave the clenched fist salute. It was an answer to that, the answer to the Communist International, the results of which you've seen recently in the support of the old parties, and that's what we were fighting, and giving the salute of European manhood, and I'm proud of it.
British Union is the movement of the people of Britain. It is their answer and their challenge to the tyranny that today oppresses them. That tyranny is the money power of international finance, which commands government, parliament, and the old political parties. In the service of finance, an obsolete and decadent system is preserved, both in government and industry. Government is paralyzed by a system of universal talk in which nothing can be done, in order that real power may rest elsewhere, not in the hands of those chosen by the people, but in the hands of those chosen by finance, In face of these new conditions, how can any international system maintain the British standard of life, that alone increase it to the high level that modern science makes possible and that our great people deserve? For in this modern age, science gives to us British the power to use our own great heritage of British Empire to build the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. We have the finest workers and technicians. One thing alone we lack, a market to absorb the great wealth that modern industry can produce. That market is the purchasing power of the British people. They are robbed of the power to buy British goods because their wages are dragged down by cheap slave competition from abroad. They are subject to that competition because finance draws its usury from foreign investment in the shape of cheap foreign goods. We British are denied our heritage by the power of usury, by the power of usury. So we challenge finance and the parties who have sold the people to usury. carry out the people's will and to subordinate to the nation the vested interests who today exploit the people. We ask from the people power for the people's government. That power will be freely given by the vote of the people and can be removed by the vote of the people. But the government elected by the people must have power to act. If the people's government has not power to govern, then the money power will continue to govern. That money power has divided the British people in order that it may rule them, We have been divided by the war of party, of class and of faction. So the British, who for 1,000 years have never been conquered by the foe without, have been subdued by the foe within. Britons who should be brothers have fought each other, and alien finance has conquered. Therefore to our brother Britons we say, unite. Britain united is invincible and irresistible, and together we will build the mightiest civilization mankind has known.